What is the difference between service to self and taking care of oneself? Your question this evening is one which is an interesting question in that it has various facets to it. The question of whether one's care of the self can be considered positive or negative, and if it is one or the other, or perhaps if it is neither. Is there some means by which it might aid your movement forward into the fourth density of love and understanding? One of the facets of this question is the intention that you have when you take care of yourself. Are you in the desire to do so, wishing to have the overall effect of this care be that which aids you in serving others? Is this something you are conscious of? Is this a conscious choice? A choice made with the perceived outcome, shall we say, of such a choice? Is this a choice which is made subconsciously, without thought given to evaluate the potential of the choice, to achieve an end that is helpful to more than yourself? Or is it your self-care that is utilized only for your own benefit in a manner which might affect another person in your circle of friends or people that you meet on the street, shall we say, in a negative way, in that you would not take their needs into consideration? These are a couple of the facets that one might consider in how one approaches the concept of self-care. The nature of the awareness and the intention of the seeker of truth is what can only be known by the seeker of truth. If the seeker of truth is conscious of his or her own nature, his or her own intentions, his or her own desires, these must be left to the seeker in order to be able to evaluate the quality and purpose of taking care of the self. Another facet is you have the self that is considered the higher self, that can also participate in caring for your worldly self, your mind-body-spirit complex. You have the subconscious self that might also aid in such endeavors. If you are conscious of both of these selves and utilize their desire and ability to aid you in taking care of yourself, then again, there is the possibility that this cumulative effort of unconscious and higher self working with your personality self, shall we say, could be utilized in a more positive manner. All of these selves, as you are also aware, are portions of the great self, the one infinite creator. Again, we suggest that this question, considering the layers or facets of the self, is one which is not easily determined, for much is not always consciously known by the spiritual seeker. To explore the aspect of this query involving one's own intention and awareness of the self and one's own motivations behind taking self-care, or interacting with the self in any way, we feel it would be good to look back at the evolutionary progress made by each seeker and how the orientation of seeking and orientation of the choice develops on the spiritual journey of the mind-body-spirit complex to the Creator. As the entity, or the mind-body-spirit complex, departs from the second density and enters the third density of self-awareness, the experience of the entity up to that point has been built upon what you could call instinct, or various patterns of activity that unfold in a way of action and reaction, with little contemplation for the intention or the meaning behind the actions of the individual. Once this individual entity enters into the third density, the spark of awareness presents itself to the entity and thus allows for the potential of that entity to reflect upon their own actions and their own patterns and their own environment around them in a way that allows them to approach these things in a conscious manner. However, for the new or young third density entity, this is not an immediate grasping of the needle, you might say. Instead, though the self has gained the spark of self-awareness, the tendency of patterns and unconscious biases continue to unfold within the entity's own energy fields, and these patterns guide the behavior and the actions, and most importantly, the perceptions of the entity. The process of welding this self-awareness to then become a conscious entity that interacts with the self, with other self, and with the environment about the self develops slowly over a period of many lifetimes. Some entities quicker than others. Some slower, preferring to take the pace of the tortoise, you might say. And often this unfolding repeats itself in a microcosm within the singular life experience or incarnation of any given entity, where it is the hope of the entity who incarnates that the previous lessons and the previous orientation of conscious awareness of one's own being and one's own patterns develops within a lifetime efficiently, building upon the previous experiences of past lifetimes. This is an important backdrop to the question that you have posed for the circle, for it is the awareness of one's own self and one's own environment and other selves and the conscious relationship with these things that determine the polarity of an entity, with the slow realization of the entity, the patterns present within the self, can be realized and transmuted in a conscious fashion in order to choose how one relates to the self and to the other selves and to the creation of the Creator. The relationship that one forms with all of these things is the heart of one's polarity of consciousness. It is the meaning behind service to others and service to self, and even the sinkhole of indifference. For as this relationship unfolds, the seeker is confronted with the option of seeing the self in relationship to other selves and in relationship to one's environment, and determine what these aspects of one's experience mean to the self and how one relates to them. The seeker could relate in a way that either utilizes them and uses them in order to gain more power for the self, more influence, to gain the ability to mold one's own creation, environment, and other selves to one's own liking, so that the self can create a universe within one's own image. Or one can gaze upon the self in relationship to all of these things and recognize the larger patterns of the Creator unfolding in love and in light, and choose to engage with this dance of the Creator and its various harmonies and tones and flavors, and approach one's own creation not with a sense of individual ownership and sovereignty as a dictator of one's own cosmic empire, but rather as a family member taking part in a familiar and harmonious activity of learning and exploring and sharing in the love and the light of the Creator. These are depictions of what we, the Confederation of Planets, in service to the One Infinite Creator, are referring when we discuss to the notion of polarity, of consciousness, and of service to self and service to others. We present this depiction, which is limited, we may say, for the sake of grappling with this question, in order to present a new question for any seeker who is curious about the dynamic addressed within your query. When one cares for the self, is one doing so with the attitude of the dictator, who must preserve the self above all else and use any means necessary of other selves or self in order to prop the self up above all others, so that the universe may be ordered according to the whims of the self more effectively. This is a form of what you could call self-care, for it implies that one cares so much for the self that they are willing to do so at the expense of all else. This is an effective means of exploring the creation and is a valid path for treading the path back to the Creator from which one came. It's a choice. Or does one care for the self as one cares for the rest of the creation? Does one see the self as the integral aspect of the grand, majestic mechanism of the one infinite creation that must be tended to and loved and cared for in order for this system of intricate energies interacting and dancing with each other to operate in harmony and to recognize and bow to the will of the one infinite creator within the self, so that the creator may shine more brightly thanks to the care one shows for the self. For when we reference the notion of service to others, this is not intended to exclude the self from being worthy of being served, of being loved, and being cared for. We would, through this instrument, offer a slightly challenging response to everything that we have just shared. And that is that when one may see the self as caring for the self out of the desire of harmony and service to others, we also find, particularly within your third density, that this can be an easy crutch, you might say, to fall back into patterns of indifference, while telling the self that one must care for the self in order to operate as an agent of the Creator and of service to others. And yet, it is simply because this self-care is comfortable and is less scary than taking the risk of service to others, of facing potential sacrifice of the self in order to express one's care for others. This can be a complicated dynamic and requires a constant revisiting of one's intentions, which is why we always emphasize the necessity of a regular practice of meditation and contemplation and prayer for the seeker. For with these regular practices in place, one can reserve a space for the self that allows the self to reflect upon these things and question these things regularly. If one is perhaps engaging with patterns of supposed self-care that are in reality more indicative of patterns of indifference and hiding behind comfort, one can reveal this reality to the self through this regular practice, and the hope is to adjust one's perspective consciously and willfully, so that the pattern of indifference can shift and the self-care becomes more genuine and in line with the desire of service to others, rather than a falling back into the comfort of indifference. As has been spoken through the previous two instruments, careful consideration of intention and motivation are key to understanding the difference between self-care and service to self actions. And through this instrument, we would like to explore the other end of the spectrum, if you will. The seeker who wishes to or needs to practice self-care but lacks the self-worth, or is deceived by a sense of low self-worth. A martyr, if you will, in the journey of service to others, the one who gives and gives and gives and never allows itself the chance to receive. This instrument is reminded of a story or a lesson, if you will. This analogy or a metaphor is the idea that each soul has a vessel of love and attention and care. And as the soul, the entity interacts with other self, tends to other self, in service to other self, that entity gifts a portion of that vessel's contents, its love, its care to the other self, to replenish the vessel of that other self. But without replenishing its own vessel, you can see how that vessel eventually becomes depleted. And when that vessel is depleted, the ability for that self to act in service to others is inhibited. There is a full stop to that service, for the entity has martyred themselves or sacrificed themselves to that service to others. Therefore, we would remind you that you are worthy of that self-care. You are worthy of replenishing your vessel, whatever that may look like, so long as the intention is ultimately one of service to others, recognizing that the self is an other, is an extension of another. If one recognizes that one's intentions are pure, for lack of a better word, if one's intentions are set on not controlling but loving and accepting others, one can sit in peace, knowing that actions taken to care for self are but merely part of the process in service to others.